A detective on the verge of a breakdown, a priest at the edge of faith, and the mysterious man in cell 11. The legacy of the Exorcist franchise is strange, to say the least. A hit film adapted from a hit novel that became immediately infamous for its effect on audiences, that led to a failed sequel. Eventually, there were 2 prequel movies, a TV series, and another legacy sequel is on the way. But let's focus on what's become my favorite of the entire series. Yes, more than the original. The Exorcist III. Based on the novel Legion, The Exorcist III was written and directed by William Peter Blatty and is set 15 years after the original, focusing on Lieutenant William Kinderman, a minor character in the original story and now played by George C. Scott. And while Kinderman has maintained a strong friendship with Catholic priest Father Joseph Dyer, played by Ed Flanders, both are still haunted by the death of Father Damien Karras during the exorcism of Regan McNeil. Suddenly, a string of murders erupt across Georgetown, done in the style of the long-dead Gemini killer. As Kinderman investigates the killings, he begins to question the fate of Father Karras and his beliefs about God, the devil, and the nature of good and evil. Released in 1990, The Exorcist III had a mixed reception, but in the years since, its distinct vision and approach to similar themes of the original, with a completely different lens, have made it more and more unique in the growing field of supernatural horror shaped by Blatty and Friedkin's original movie. But the creation of Exorcist was no easy matter. How does The Exorcist III respond to the success of the original? How does Blatty translate his own work to the screen? What did studio interference do to this horror detective story? And where do faith and horror intersect for something truly disturbing? The answers lie in a deep, dark cell where evil waits to be unleashed. The Exorcist III is the result of more than a decade's worth of effort by William Peter Blatty, writer of the original novel The Exorcist, and screenwriter of its adaptation by William Friedkin. The Exorcist, of course, was a massive film, a phenomenon, and its success quickly led to a sequel, which had neither Friedkin nor Blatty involved and is embarrassing.
I am Zuzu.
But Warner Brothers was still hungry for another entry in the franchise, leading to Blatty conceiving of a new story as strictly a screenplay. However, disagreements between him and Friedkin put the film into development hell. Eventually, Blatty turned the story into the novel Legion, published in 1983, another hit, and went on to revert his story back into a screenplay, which he would eventually direct under Morgan Creek Productions. Exorcist III, while sharing thematic DNA with the original thanks to Blatty's involvement, is completely different in its execution of similar ideas regarding faith, doubt, and the stark realization of true evil in the world. With Kinderman at its center, Exorcist III, which Blatty originally wanted to simply call Legion, functions as a police procedural, where crime scenes and discussions of the Gemini murders are the catalyst to discussions of faith. But when compared to Blatty's first story, which is incredibly dark but ends on a hopeful, healing note, Exorcist III is incredibly bleak. And it was Blatty's insistence that added in the burgeoning friendship to the end of the version you've never seen. If The Exorcist asks the question, why would something this evil happen to an innocent young girl? Then Legion asks the question, how can anything good happen in a world this evil? In both films, Blatty depicts evil and demonic possession as very real, obvious to the human eye, and something that eventually no character can deny. But the presence of God and heaven is obscured. There's no need for faith to believe in true evil, just to believe in true good. Blatty, a prolific writer and director of only 2 films, this and The Ninth Configuration, centered so much of his writings on issues of faith and spirituality, some more explicit and horrifying than others. It probably shouldn't be surprising given Blatty's personal life. He graduated valedictorian from the Jesuit Brooklyn Preparatory School, attended Georgetown University with a degree in English, and joined the Air Force, where he spent 4 years in the Psychological Warfare Division. In some ways, Blatty's Exorcist stories are psychological warfare tales, not just depicting men and women under attack by demonic forces, but structured as psychological warfare on the audience, with subliminal flashes of images and disquieting sound designs that unnerve and soften up the audience for the horrors to come. Regarding his Faith trilogy composed of The Exorcist, The Ninth Configuration, and Legion, Blatty later said, "Taken together, they are all about the eternal questions. Why are we here? What are we supposed to be doing? Why do we die? Is there a God?" The Exorcist approached this last question, which is the heart of all the others, by seeking to confirm the existence of demons and the power of religious faith to deal with them. The Ninth Configuration approached the problem via what I call the mystery of goodness. If we are reducible to matter without spirit, to soulless atomic structures, then we ought to be always rushing blindly and irresistibly to serve our own selfish ends. Yet how is that there is love in this world? Love as a god might love, and that a man will give his life for another. But then, in Legion, Ivan Karamazov's greatest barrier to religious faith, the suffering of the innocent, the problem of evil, is met head-on by Lieutenant Kinderman. Blatty is referring to Fyodor Dostoevsky's novel The Brothers Karamazov, and its central questioning of the theology of suffering. The Exorcist III and Blatty's novel Legion insist upon the reality of heaven and hell, but never provide easy answers. All of this is translated through the lens of horror. Of course, horror is much scarier when the devil is real and near, but God is out of sight. By and large, Exorcist III is much less explicit than the original film, which spent much of its runtime either depicting brutal medical tests or laborious exorcism procedures, with a young girl falling apart from the demon inside her. Here, Blatty's movie almost never shows the fate of the Gemini's victims. Instead, we either see Scott's Kinderman react to the horrors off-screen and under bloody sheets, or hear descriptions of what's happened.
Then the killer stuffed her body with other materials and sewed her back up.
And Scott, a low-key horror MVP thanks to his work here and in The Changeling, is a man on the constant verge of an aneurysm.
You make a lot of people nervous.
Only sinners.
Everybody!
Is everything all right in here, guys?
We're fine!
Completely worn out in his vulnerable conversations with Father Dyer, an extremely witty and sharp-tongued performance by Flanders.
So what, am I supposed to give spiritual advice in a vacuum?
And exploding at the slightest provocation during his investigation.
You shut your mouth!
This Kinderman is a far cry from the gentle, sweet detective of the original. It's a man on the far end of a career spent seeing the worst of humanity every day, and not able to take much more. The closer Kinderman gets to the true identity of Patient X, the more his already damaged faith in humanity is shaken. In both the novel and film, Blatty uses the real-life Zodiac killer as the basis for his Gemini killer, sharing similarities in methods, eccentricities in spelling and messages, and the unresolved nature of their identities. The Zodiac even once referred to The Exorcist as the best satirical comedy that I have ever seen, in one of their letters. Very Beetlejuice.
I've seen The Exorcist about 167 times, and it keeps getting funnier every single time I see it!
And while the Zodiac was never caught and their motives remain forever a mystery, Legion reveals the Gemini as being devoted to the devil, and completely satanic in their motivations. The film hints at the Gemini's past, but Blatty's novel fully reveals that James Veneman, the real name of the killer, was the son of a preacher, and his hatred of his father led to his sacrilegious killings in an effort to shame the man. In any case, the Gemini is in pursuit of making Kinderman believe in his identity, accept the realities of hell, and destroy as many souls as possible in the process. He's a man made into a demon. With the title Legion, Blatty's story evokes Christ's encounter with a man possessed by many demons, but in reverse. Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" "My name is Legion," he replied, "for we are many." Here in Lieutenant Kinderman's encounter with the Gemini killer, our hero is not a perfect, powerful savior, but an extremely flawed, constantly doubting man. And the adversary is not many who go into one, but one who goes into many. Who is the mysterious Patient X? We learn that it's the body of Father Damien Karras, who 15 years ago had the spirit of the recently executed Gemini killer forced into his body by what was likely the devil. The act slowly rebuilt Karis's body and mind, and allowed the Gemini to go on killing, possessing the bodies of the elderly patients of the mental institution for the sake of torturing Karis's imprisoned spirits and spiting God. This is 100% George C. Scott's movie, but he's surrounded by several fantastic performances. Brad Dourif is just incredible. The way he works his voice, somewhat manipulated in post, sometimes replaced by actress Colleen Dewhurst, is disturbing.
He is inside with us! He will never get away! His pain won't end!
For all the scares here, Exorcist III is completely dependent on the strengths of its central performances, because these really long scenes of dialogue, sometimes monologues, are what the film is built on. The good news is that the dialogue here is just so good, and I could have an entire movie of Dyer and Kinderman having a conversation over dinner. It's like a darker, more pessimistic version of My Dinner with Andre, a classic of its own.
The whole world is a homicide victim, Father. Would a God who is good invent something like death?
Kinderman is burnt out, completely disillusioned with not just the criminal justice system or society, but the very nature of existence. Dyer keeps the faith, but it's obvious that the grim reality of the world conveyed to him by Kinderman is weighing on him. Do we keep the faith despite the world around us? Is it really a wonderful life? There are so many little choices made in the sound design here. Whispered words without a recognizable source, thrumming roars, a rising animal growl, voices and screams that overlap with the moments that come before. It's disorienting and discomfiting in all the right ways, adding tension to even innocuous conversations. All of these production choices that I'm talking about are in the theatrical cut of Blatty's movie, which is the result of director and studio fighting and compromising over a reshot version of the movie. Blatty's book and script are what drew studio attention and the eventual greenlight. However, once initial filming had finished, the heads of Morgan Creek became unsatisfied, with a negative test screening solidifying their opinion that several major elements needed to change, quickly forcing reshoots, re-edits, and additions that Blatty agreed to do himself instead of letting the studio replace him. Two of the biggest changes insisted by the studio were the inclusion of Jason Miller, reprising his role as Father Karras when the Gemini isn't assuming control, and a climactic exorcism, which now serves as the bombastic ending to a story that's mostly subdued in the hour and a half beforehand. Studio heads felt that a movie entitled Exorcist III, which they insisted on instead of Legion, needed an exorcism. And to set it up, a new character named Father Morning is added in scenes completely disconnected from the rest of the story. Once you realize how the studio jimmied the character into the cut, you can't unsee it. Blatty's director's cut, which remained unseen for years until reassembled by Scream Factory in 2016 using VHS copies of dailies, is a much more subdued affair. In Blatty's original cut, the possessed body of Father Karras is only played by Brad Dourif, casting greater doubt on the true identity of Patient X. Dourif's original performance is also a lot more low-key. In the theatrical cut, Karras' body switches performers depending on who is in control, with Miller looking like hammered dog shit. Dourif's performance here is also so much bigger.
No, I am not! I'm alive! I go on! I breathe!
In reflecting on the changes, Dourif later said, "The original version was a hell of a lot purer, and I liked it much more. As it stands now, it's a mediocre film. There are parts that have no right to be there. But in my opinion, Dourif's operatic approach in the reshoots and the bewildering switching between identities is much better. You could say that Dourif goes over the top. I would say the man has no top. It's impossible for him to go over it.
Without spilling one single drop of blood. Now, I call that showmanship, Lieutenant.
Kinderman's encounters with the Gemini overpower him. The only person able to fully overcome a character as big and self-assured as Scott's character. They create fear, not because they sow doubt, but because they sow belief. Belief in something more powerful and more evil than what Kinderman already thought about the world. I often find that supernatural horror movies leverage faith, the afterlife, and demons as a method to just scare the audience in ways they're familiar with, using shorthand like possession and demons to quickly get under the skin of viewers. The Exorcist crystallized the modern idea of supernatural horror by directly translating biblical fears into the modern day. An endless barrage of supernatural horror is still using the iconography of The Exorcist for very obvious scares. When you watch any of Blatty's films or read any of his books, it's very clear he believed in heaven, hell, and the spiritual nature of humanity, but that he was always wrestling with what that meant in a world where murder, hate, exploitation, and a seemingly endless cycle of destruction were far more apparent in everyday life than a seemingly just and loving God. Blatty's original Exorcist novel was inspired by the real-life story of a possession of a 14-year-old boy in 1949. How much you believe that to be actually true is up to you, but to Blatty, it was real and aligned with his faith. Regarding that first novel, Blatty said, "I was trying to get across that this is not a horror story. This is real. It is a great mystery that Providence should permit diabolical activity, but we know that God works for good with those who love him. Legion may not be based in any real-world parallels beyond the Zodiac's inspiration, but it reflects the author's beliefs, and that's what makes the story powerful." I've often found myself questioning what the tension between good and evil in both individuals and the world at large means in regards to the presence of a loving God. Are we being tested, meant to suffer, called to heal, or is it all pure randomness? The ravings of electrified meat trying to bring greater meaning to existence. You ever have a moment where an encounter in life or just a story on the news changes your worldview? And not for the better. This is the driving idea of Exorcist III. Of course, it's all so heightened, and much more heightened than the original film and novel, that it's easier to disconnect from the horrors of the movie. That's horror. I say this a lot, but horror allows us to externalize our fears, and even our own past experiences through a heightened story that translates real fears and losses through metaphors. The original Exorcist is about what it means to live in an existence where God, the devil, heaven, and hell are real and right inside your own home. "I always believe that there is a divine hand everywhere," said Blatty. A novelist first and a filmmaker a distant second, Exorcist III is willing to make many different leaps in logic and sharp changes in focus in pursuit of the larger themes of the film, instead of adhering to typical structure. And there's no greater example of this than Kinderman's sudden trip to the afterlife at the end of the film's first act. Here, in a hazy dream of a heavenly train station filled with hospital beds, big band angels, and the recently deceased, Kinderman sees the recent victims of the Gemini killer, including Father Dyer.
You know, I wonder if both of us are dreaming this.
No, Bill. I'm not dreaming.
Is it a dream, a vision, a brief, out-of-body experience? Blatty is willing to keep tension and the uncertainty of the afterlife for a little bit. But Exorcist III is a story in full belief of heaven, hell, and the soul. With cinematography by Jerry Fisher, Blatty shoots his horrors in very long, patient shots. Apropos for the time, the film's jump scares are punctuated by loud noises. But Exorcist III has one of the greatest jump scares of all time. Sticking to the rules of the jump scare, build anticipation, diffuse tension with a false scare, bust out the real scare just as audiences have relaxed, but holding the tension for way longer than you would ever guess. Shot almost entirely in one single lockdown shot at the far end of a hospital hallway, we patiently wait for a night shift nurse to complete her routines, briefly scared by a sleeping doctor. But the beauty of this scare is that we're not quite sure what we're waiting for. Just that we know nothing good could possibly happen. And when it does, it's oddly disturbing and sudden, all captured in a perfectly timed snap zoom. Blatty's instincts as a director are so unique. He's clearly able to direct terrifying horror that appeals to mainstream audiences, but he's rarely in pursuit of conventional structure or your go-to horror tropes. Exorcist III begins with the bedrock of a well-worn friendship, becomes a bewildering detective story, and spirals into a flesh-ripping encounter with pure evil, stripping away the layers of society and safety as the casual hatred of the world is curdled into pure evil. Exorcist III is a story about lucidity. The hospital where the story takes place contains a mental ward filled with elderly suffering from dementia and near catatonia. These older patients rarely become lucid. Instead, they're lost in thought and unable to understand what's going on around them. They're almost empty vessels, primed to be used by the demonically empowered soul of the killer. And these supernatural killings awaken Kinderman to the reality of evil in the world. This is the story of a small group of people awakening from their own form of catatonia to see the spiritual world around them. The more our detective interacts with patient X, the more he's forced to accept the truth.
If you looked with the eyes of faith, you'd see me.
Miller is the body. Dorif is the soul. We're not quite sure how much Kinderman sees himself. He may see everything or deny it, or see little but be aware of what's behind the veil. But in any case, we, the audience, see with the eyes of faith. Eventually, Kinderman can no longer deny what's in front of his eyes. The theatrical and director's cut endings serve very different purposes, and create two very different outlooks of the story. The director's cut, which barely shows any actual supernatural occurrences, forces Kinderman and the audience to draw their own conclusions about the nature of the Gemini killer, and the reality of hell and demons in what's happened. The theatrical cut explicitly reveals the truth, with hell opening up and the many victims of the Gemini killer, previously only spoken about, now shown in full. Honestly, I find the director's cut to be underwhelming. The theatrical version isn't perfect, and the studio mandates are obvious at times, but this wild nightmare climax is the fulfillment of every fear and belief laid out in the rest of the film. Kinderman's confession in the shape of a hellish crucifix reflects the same outlook as Blatty.
Every possible ugliness and corruption, you son of a bitch!
While Blatty's story takes its name and central premise of possession from Christ's encounter with the Legion, I think that its outlook on faith and man's relation to the unknowability of God is much more akin to the Book of Job. Christ's story is comforting. It portrays a loving God that has come to earth and not just brought salvation with him, but the peace of a God that is knowable. The Old Testament book of Job offers no easy answers. It's the story of a faithful, pious, successful man named Job, who becomes the center of a wager between God and Satan. The devil claims that if Job lost everything that God gave him, he'd lose his faith. So God removes his protection from his servant, and Satan takes away Job's wealth, kills his children, and afflicts him with disease. The majority of the book centers on Job's conversations with his family and friends, who question God's goodness and why Job chooses to remain faithful. With the man's refrain, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Keeping his faith even as he wishes for death. In the end, Job's faith remains intact. Satan is proven wrong, and God restores much of his life. But there are no easy answers to be given to Job for why this all happened. Even when God finally speaks to him, it's an assertion of his power and knowledge over the limited understanding of mankind. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set? Or who laid its cornerstone? While the morning stars sang together, and all the angels shouted for joy. This goes on for a long time, with God big-dogging my dude across Job chapters 38 through 41. Job then responds, "I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. You asked, who is this that obscures my plans without knowledge? Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. You said, listen now and I will speak. I will question you and you shall answer me. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes." Job is blessed by God, but lives the rest of his life never understanding why all of this happened to him. Like the Book of Job, Kinderman is left without real comfort, only the knowledge that evil is real. And yet, if Blatty believes that God plays a role in everything, then he must be in that cell with Kinderman, the Gemini, and the dying Father Mourning, giving the priest enough strength to help Karis resurface for just long enough.
Bill, now! Shoot now! Kill me now!
The Gemini is finally stopped, but the toll taken on Kinderman is undeniable. Where is God in Blatty's piece of gothic detective horror? Where is God in the world today? You'll have to decide for yourself. Thanks for watching today's video. Several years ago I did a video about The Exorcist, and ever since, The Exorcist III has been on my long list of movies to cover. It's a truly strange, bewildering, and often very scary movie. And while I do think it has been reevaluated and reappraised in recent years, it still doesn't get the attention that the original does. And I totally get that. The original Exorcist is a classic, and has shaped so much of horror in the years since. And The Exorcist III is this oddball sequel that doesn't really fit into any sort of category. It's kind of a detective story, it's kind of a religion story, and obviously it's kind of a horror story. But with Blatty directing and writing, it feels totally original. And that's what I really love about it. Obviously it has its flaws, and I don't think the theatrical cut or the director's cut are perfect by any means, but I find them to be fascinating and really resonant with me. And I love George C. Scott as Kinderman, just screaming at the top of his lungs and always about to burst a blood vessel. And I love his conversations with Ed Flanders as Father Dyer. Seriously, I would have loved just an entire movie of those conversations. They are amazing. And I think that's the strength of having someone like Blatty be the writer of the script. You can really tell that he's a novelist. Also, there's strange cameos like Fabio is in heaven, and Larry King shows up for like a single shot. But I think they all just add to the really weirdo texture of the film. And Blatty, being a person that had a really deep personal faith, brings all of that through to his movie. So the questions of faith and belief and religious undertones cannot be denied here. They are essential to the meaning of the film, its questions, and the way it does its horror. And of course, that really long jump scare with the medical shears is an all-time classic. One of the best scares in horror history. So I hope that my video has encouraged you to check out Exorcist III if you haven't, or give it a rewatch. There's a great edition with both the theatrical and director's cuts from Scream Factory. Scream Factory the GOAT. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on The Exorcist III as well, and your general thoughts on the Exorcist franchise. I can't believe that there's another Exorcist movie coming this year by David Gordon Green. They let the man get more work after Halloween ends. As always, a huge thank you to my patrons for their continued support, and if you'd like to be a patron, it's only $1 a month for early access to every video and exclusive Patreon-only reviews. I recently did a Q&A responding to questions asked by my patrons, and that's about an hour and a half long, and it's only on Patreon. And until next time, I hope that you're taking care of yourselves, and if you find yourself in a hospital with a mental ward with a lot of elderly patients, I suggest looking up and checking the ceiling, just in case there's someone crawling along it. You never know who's just going to be hanging out up there.